My family left me behind at a rest stop when I was 23, leaving me stranded without any money or a phone. Now, they've reached out, asking for money. That summer, when I turned 23, I expected it to be just like any other day. I worked at my father's hardware store for some cash and lived at home because, according to my brother, my father's college dreams for me were impractical. I was also the constant target for my golden child brother, Ethan. We weren't poor, but we certainly weren't the type to take extravagant vacations. So, when my father announced that we were going on a family road trip to my uncle's wedding in Colorado, I should have sensed something was off. 3 days into that dreadful journey, I was already regretting not making up an excuse to stay home. My father and Ethan had been taking turns making my life miserable, while my mother, Linda, occasionally chimed in with her frail voice, saying, "That's enough," but we all knew it was just for show. I need to explain something about my family. My father, Banks, wasn't your typical dad. He was the kind of person who would wake you up at 3 a.m. to rant about something trivial or toss your belongings if they got in his way. He had been telling me I was worthless since I could understand words. Ethan quickly figured out that he could either be Dad's little shadow or be like me. Guess which path he chose? That morning, we stopped at a rest area in Colorado that felt like it was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and distant mountains, with a tiny restroom facility and a couple of vending machines. I had been dozing in the back of our SUV and needed to stretch my legs and use the restroom. Dad and Ethan were laughing about something, while Mom was busy checking her makeup in the visor mirror. I remember what I was wearing, an old Nirvana t-shirt, jeans with a hole in one knee, and my worn-out sneakers that I had for years. I didn't take my phone because it was charging in the car, and I didn't grab my wallet. Why would I? We were in the middle of nowhere, and I was just taking a quick bathroom break. I spent about 10 minutes in that restroom, maybe even less. When I stepped out, blinking in the bright Colorado sun, the parking lot was empty. Our dark green SUV was gone. At first, I thought they had moved it as a prank. I wandered around the rest area, but there was nothing. That's the thing about betrayal from your own family, it hits differently than any other kind. I sat on the curb for an hour, convincing myself they were just trying to scare me and would be back soon. People came and went, some giving me strange looks. A truck driver asked if I was okay, and I lied, saying I was waiting for my girlfriend in the bathroom. He nodded and left. After 2 hours, a chill settled in my stomach. They weren't coming back. My first instinct was to borrow someone's phone and call them, begging them to come get me. But as I approached a mother with 2 kids, something stopped me. A flood of memories rushed through my mind, every humiliation, every time they laughed at my expense, and every cruel joke that was disguised as humor. I could almost hear Ethan's voice, "Dude, I bet he's crying right now," and my father's dismissive tone, "He'll figure it out if he's not as stupid as he seems." My mother's faint protests never changed anything. So, I made a decision. I approached that mother and asked to use her phone, but instead of calling my family, I called information and got the number for the nearest shelter in Grand Junction, about 40 miles away. I then asked her if she could give me a ride into town, saying my family had an emergency and had to leave but would send someone for me later. She hesitated, but I must have looked innocent enough because she agreed. That first night in the shelter was a harsh reality check. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, no ID, no money, no connections. Dave, the shelter employee, let me use their computer to look up my uncle's address from a wedding invitation I had seen. I thought I could go to the wedding and find my family, but as I sat there staring at the screen, I wondered why I would want to chase after people who had literally abandoned me for laughs. Instead, I created a new email account, searched for services that helped with emergency ID replacements, Googled cash-paying jobs, and devised a plan. 2 days later, I found myself washing dishes at a small diner called Sonny's. The owner, a woman in her 60s with purple-streaked gray hair and more tattoos than I expected, was tough but fair. I walked in, asked if they needed help. The next day, I went to the Verizon store and changed my phone number completely. I imagined my family growing increasingly frustrated as they realized their punching bag wasn't coming back for more. A month later, I had my own studio apartment above a laundromat. It was small and always smelled like fabric softener, but it was mine. I worked my way up to prep cook at Sonny's, and Geraldine was teaching me how to chop vegetables properly without losing a finger. Occasionally, I would check my old email address, the one my family knew, and messages piled up from my mother, "Please come home, we're sorry," from my father, "This childish stunt needs to end right now," and from Ethan, "Dude, it was just a joke. Stop being such a baby." I never replied, not once. The thing about freedom is that once you've tasted it, you can't go back to the cage. I won't pretend it was easy. Some nights, I would scroll through Instagram and see photos of people with normal families who genuinely loved each other, and I would feel an ache that no amount of distraction could satisfy. There were nights when loneliness threatened to consume me whole. The holidays were the hardest. But every morning, I would wake up in my dingy little apartment that smelled like Downy, go to my dishwashing job where no one labeled me worthless, and build my life one brick at a time. 3 months after they abandoned me at that rest stop, I checked my inbox for the last time. There was a new message from my mother: "Your grandmother is asking about you. Please just let us know you're alive." I closed the email, erased the account, and tossed my old SIM card into the dumpster behind Sonny's. That night, Geraldine showed me how to bake her famous apple pie. She told me I had good pastry skills, and it was the first real compliment I had received in years. I never looked back. Fast forward 5 years after being left at that Colorado rest area, and I found myself staring at a familiar face on my Facebook page, not because I was stalking my family's profiles, well, maybe I was, but because Ethan had recently been mentioned in a local news article back home. He had received a DUI and wrapped his car around a telephone pole. Nobody was hurt except the pole. The publication had used one of his high school football photos. He looked youthful and smug, a stark contrast to the bloated mugshot below. That's the thing about karma, it moves at its own pace and never forgets an address. By then, I had built something resembling a life in Colorado. My tiny studio above the laundromat was eventually traded for a one-bedroom apartment with actual windows. I had worked my way up from dishwasher to line cook, and then to assistant manager at Sonny's. Geraldine still ran the place with an iron fist and a flour-dusted glove, but she had started treating me more like a quirky nephew than a charity case. My first major purchase when I finally had some savings was a decent laptop, nothing fancy, just enough to enroll in online community college classes for business management and basic accounting, which my father always claimed were for people who couldn't do real work. I spent my mornings at Sonny's, my afternoons studying, and my evenings working, rinse and repeat. Look, I'm not going to pretend that what happened didn't leave me messed up. I had trust issues, more like trust subscriptions that I could cancel whenever someone got too close. In 5 years, I had made only 2 friends, my neighbor Doug, who played bass in a terrible garage band and occasionally brought me homemade beer that tasted like hoppy dishwater, and Geraldine, if she counted as a friend rather than a boss. That dynamic shifted when Kendra started coming into Sonny's every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork. She always ordered the same thing, a Denver omelet with no tomatoes and an extra coffee. Often, she would sit at the counter with a textbook for med school. I later discovered she had this habit of completely zoning out while studying. One time, I timed her. It took her 7 minutes and 23 seconds before she noticed she was holding a fork halfway to her mouth with cold eggs on it. I had been giving her coffee refills for 4 months before she actually really saw me. Her eyes widened slightly as she pointed out that my name tag was spelled incorrectly. It wasn't, but it became our strange little joke. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she would tease me about wearing the wrong name, Salvador, Salvador, Salvador. I would act startled. It was the silliest flirtation ever, but it worked. Our first date wasn't even intended to be a date. Her study group canceled at the last minute, and she had a reservation at a popular pizza place that was hard to get into. I happened to be cleaning the counter when she received the cancellation text. I scrolled through social media, seeing my family's regular throwback photos of us all smiling and posts about how much they missed her boys. It was rich, considering my mother would tag Ethan but never mention me, as if I had been erased from existence. Ethan moved from job to job, posting vague updates about haters and new opportunities, the standard social media smokescreen of someone whose life was circling the abyss. 3 years in, Geraldine approached me during inventory and informed me she was considering opening a second Sonny's on the opposite side of town. She asked if I was interested in running it, rather than owning it. This was an important distinction. I didn't sleep that night because I kept thinking it was a test or a joke. People like me didn't get opportunities like that. Banks had made sure I understood that much. That's the problem with poisonous beliefs, they linger in your system long after you've left the serpent. But I said yes because Kendra, who was half asleep next to me, whispered that it would be silly not to. Doug, through a haze of cannabis smoke, replied, "Duh, you practically run the original place already." Geraldine wasn't Banks, she wasn't my family, and she had never made me feel useless. Sonny's East opened 6 months later, smaller than its predecessor and with a new menu, my menu. I worked 90-hour weeks for the first year and lost 10 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. I argued with Kendra about never being home, and I came back to passive-aggressive post-its on the fridge several times. But it worked. People came in, and they came back. The food was delicious, and the atmosphere was inviting. We weren't getting rich, but we were making do. For years after being abandoned, I earned enough to help Kendra with her medical school loans, not all of them, those were monstrous, but enough to make a difference. She cried when I handed her the payment confirmation, not cinematic crying, but lovely mascara tears, real sobbing, snotty, red-faced hiccuping crying. I had never felt more like a true person than in that moment. Then my grandmother passed away. I found out on Facebook. My mother captioned a lengthy emotional homage with a million heart emojis. Grandma Rose was the only one in the family who ever stood up to Banks, the only one who seemed to notice me. She would slip me $20 when no one was looking and tell me to save it for my escape. I think she meant college, but it turned out to be more literal than that. I considered going to the funeral and even looked up airfare. Kendra said she'd come with me and hold my hand through the traumatic reunion. Doug offered me his clunky hatchback to drive instead. Geraldine simply shrugged and said, "Dead people don't know if you're there or not, so do whatever brings you peace." I didn't go. Instead, I sent flowers, a generic sympathy arrangement signed Salvador with no return address or note. It was just me. The reaction on social media was swift. My mother posted about signs and reaching out from beyond. Ethan made cryptic remarks about prodigal sons, and Banks said nothing publicly, but I could imagine the uproar behind closed doors. A week later, I received a friend request from a profile I didn't recognize, some random name with no posts and no friends. I almost deleted it until I noticed the message, "It's Uncle Rick. Your mom gave me your old email, but it bounced back. Are you okay? We've been worried. Your dad has been asking around about you." That night, I blocked the account. I had my first panic attack in 2 years, sitting on our bathroom floor at 3 a.m., trying not to wake Kendra, feeling like my lungs were collapsing and picturing Banks chasing me down, showing up at Sonny's and destroying everything I had built. Kendra found me about an hour later. She didn't ask any questions, she simply sat with me, her shoulder touching mine. When I could finally breathe, she said the most basic thing, "They can't take anything from you that you don't give them." The next morning, I called a lawyer for guidance on restraining orders, just in case. I adjusted the privacy settings on everything and asked Geraldine to notify the staff not to disclose any information about me to anyone. Practical steps, power over what you have power over. 5 years to the day after being abandoned, I married Kendra in a tiny wedding at a state park. Doug was my best man, and Geraldine baked the cake, crying the whole time, mascara pouring down her wrinkled cheeks. Kendra's enormous, boisterous family embraced me immediately, her father cracking dad jokes that didn't make me cringe, and her mother hugging me without setting off alarms in my head. For the first time in 5 years, I smiled as I remembered my family, not because I was pleased with their tragedy, but because I discovered a crucial truth: I no longer cared. I closed my laptop, climbed into bed beside my sleeping wife, and made a decision. I would continue to observe from a distance, not out of hatred or love, but because sometimes the best retribution is not what you do, but what you build while they are busy destroying themselves. Finally, we have an update. It began with a LinkedIn notification. 15 years after being abandoned at that Colorado rest stop, my perfectly planned existence had a flaw: someone viewed my profile 27 times in a single day. It's not unusual for LinkedIn recruiters to do crazy things like that, but what was remarkable was the name attached to those views, Ethan Matthews. That's the thing about the past, it is patient. It lingers in the tall grass for years before striking. By then, my life had changed drastically since my first year in Grand Junction. Kendra had finished medical school, completed her residency, and was now working 3 days a week at a local clinic to spend more time at home with our children. We had two, Ellie, who was 7, and Marcus, who was 4. The apartment above the laundromat had given way to a modest 4-bedroom home on the outskirts of town. Nothing spectacular, but it had a yard where the kids could play and where I could attempt to grow tomatoes, even though they never quite worked out. Sonny's had expanded to 3 locations, not a major franchise or anything, but enough that I no longer had to work the line except when someone called in sick. Geraldine had semi-retired 2 years before, but she still showed up unexpectedly to criticize how we made her pie crust recipe. I thought I had made peace with my past, or so I believed. I still kept an eye on my family from afar, but my frequent checks had dwindled to maybe once every few months. Banks and Irene had downsized after losing their home. As far as I understood, Ethan had been married, divorced, and married again. They all seemed to have moved on with their lives just as I had. However, the LinkedIn issue bothered me. 15 years of silence, and now this? I mentioned it to Kendra as we were performing our usual Sunday night activity, folding laundry while half-watching whatever Netflix show we were currently behind on. She paused, holding a mismatched sock in each hand, and asked whether I was all right. I nodded. What else could I say? That I felt like I was suddenly 22 years old again, stopped at a rest stop, and that I could hear Banks's voice in my head calling me useless? 3 days later, I was at Sunny's East, the original second site, assisting with inventory because our supplier had sent the wrong type of coffee filters again. When Maya at the front desk called back to say there was a family looking for me, my first thought was of Kendra's parents, who occasionally surprised us when they passed through. I strolled out front, my thoughts already turning to how to persuade them to stay for supper. But it wasn't Kendra's family. Banks appeared older, grayer, and his once intimidating physique had shrunk. Irene's face was pinched from years of effort, and her hair had been dyed an unnatural shade of brown. Ethan resembled Banks at 40, with the same stance and technique of taking up space. There was a woman with them whom I didn't recognize. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, and stood back as if she wasn't sure she belonged. Nobody spoke. The lunch rush cacophony faded away, leaving only my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Banks broke the silence first, asking for my name. I nodded, but my voice had evidently gone on vacation. I had envisioned this moment in 1,000 different ways over the course of 15 years. In some scenarios, I told them off brilliantly, in others, I was chill and distant, unconcerned about their existence. In a couple of awkward late-night fantasies, we even had a tearful reconciliation. But reality is invariably messier than fantasy. I motioned to an empty table in the corner, asked Maya to get water, and sat across from the folks who had once been my family, waiting. They had discovered me through a magazine story titled Rocky Mountain Rising, 10 Local Success Stories. It wasn't even a major feature, just a sidebar with a photo of me in front of Sunny's original location. Evidently, one of Mom's high school friends had moved to Colorado, saw it, and forwarded it to her with the caption, "Isn't this your son?" They had made 107 missed calls to my former number in the years before it was disconnected. Mom had counted, mentioning this as if it meant something. Insurance. The second residence was being foreclosed upon, and Ethan's business idea, something obscure about cryptocurrencies, had flopped terribly. Mom needed knee surgery, which she couldn't afford. They weren't there for reconciliation, they were there for money. I should have felt angry, should have thrown them out, but instead, I felt an unexpected emotion, sympathy. They seemed so small and desperate, these giants who had once ruled my entire universe were simply imperfect, broken beings. I asked them to dinner at my house that night, explaining that I needed to think and talk to Kendra first. They agreed enthusiastically, with Banks already halfway to calling it a done deal. The afternoon felt surreal. I picked up Ellie from her dance lesson and helped Marcus prepare for his preschool show and tell, all while texting Kendra updates on who was coming to dinner. She volunteered to take the children to her sisters, but I said no, I wanted them there. I wanted my family to meet my family. Dinner was chicken enchiladas, my specialty. It wasn't anything exceptional, just a recipe from the back of an old El Paso box that I had modified over the years. Ellie set the table without being asked, meticulously placing the forks on the wrong side until Kendra quietly corrected her. Marcus insisted on wearing his Spider-Man outfit because it was Tuesday, and apparently, Tuesday was now Spider-Man Day. When the doorbell rang, I nearly dropped the dish I was bringing to the table. Kendra clutched my arm as she passed, whispering that she had my back. The children looked up with interest, realizing that something significant was happening. That's the thing about dreaded moments, when they occur, they're both worse and better than you expect. The introductions were awkward. Even after adjustments, Banks continued to refer to Kendra as Karen, and Irene couldn't stop crying every time she looked at the kids, which terrified Marcus. Ethan and Poppy were the least bad, making genuine attempts at polite conversation, but Ethan kept hinting about family supporting family. After dinner, Kendra took the kids upstairs for baths and bedtime, giving me a look that said, "Text if you need extraction." Then it was just me and them, sitting in a living room that felt too small. Banks began his pitch about how family sticks together and how he'd always known I'd be successful, a lie. They only needed $220,000 to get back on their feet. Alone, of course. I let him continue, then asked if he remembered what he told me on my 18th birthday. He gave me a blank stare. I reminded him that he said, "At least you can't disappoint me anymore once you're not legally my problem." I turned to Mom and asked if she recalled what she did after Banks tossed away my acceptance letter to community college. Nothing. She had done nothing. I asked Ethan whether he remembered telling my first girlfriend that I was probably dead when she came to the house looking for me. They squirmed and made excuses. Banks's voice began to take on a deadly edge that used to make me shrink, but here's what happened: I stopped shrinking. I was 15 years and a million miles away from that person. I went to my office, returned with an envelope, and handed it to Banks. The check was for $73.50. Banks glanced at it, perplexed, and wondered what the hell this was supposed to be. I explained that in 2010, that was exactly what a Greyhound ticket from Grand Junction to our hometown would have cost, the exact amount it would have taken for me to make it back home from where you abandoned me. The hush was absolute. Then Banks began shouting at me, calling me ungrateful and greedy, claiming I had always been a disappointment. It was like the greatest hits record from my childhood was being played one more time. I didn't argue or shout back, I just stood up and informed them that it was time to leave. Mom used a different approach, tears and guilt. "How could you do this to your family?" Ethan went cold, the pleasant brother mask had entirely slipped. Poppy simply seemed embarrassed for all of them. When they finally departed, Banks crumpled the check and dropped it on our doorstep. I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs feeling unsteady. Kendra came downstairs and asked if I was all right. I nodded, not trusting my own voice. We cleaned up the dinner dishes in silence, checked on the sleeping children, and prepared for bed as if it were any other night. As I was configuring the security system, I accessed the front entrance camera on my phone. They remained in the driveway, arguing. Banks was gesticulating violently, and my mother was sobbing. Ethan was looking at our house with an expression I knew all too well, jealousy mingled with hatred. Finally, they hopped into their rental car and drove away.